The wind sliced through Grafton like a knife, its icy breath threading between the warped boards of the saloon, tugging at prayer flags nailed to the porch rail until they snapped like brittle bones. It carried no melody, only the hush of impending cruelty, as if the town itself recoiled from what was about to unfold. The square lay still, the kind of stillness that clings to a room before a scream. Wagons sat frozen mid-turn, doors cracked open just enough for eyes to peer through slivers of light, and even the crows perched on the chapel spire fell silent. At the center of it all stood a splintered crate, its edges darkened by rot and rain, dragged from the stables like gallows. On it, Evelyn Grace balanced barefoot, her swollen belly straining against the too large coat that swallowed her frame. A relic of her husband's cruelty, its collar stiff with the sour musk of sweat and whiskey. Her hands gripped its buttons as if they might stitch her back together, her knuckles raw from cold. Brown curls whipped against her cheeks, matted with sleet, while her eyes fixed on the horizon, unblinking, as though staring past the crowd could erase them. Jeb Clay loomed beside her, his grin a jagged row of yellow teeth, his voice sharp enough to crack the frost clinging to the ground. "Sturdy stock," he barked, his boot tapping the crate like a horse's hoof. "Knows how to sew, cook, and keep her mouth shut most days." A few coins clinked onto the dirt, tossed by men whose laughter hissed like embers dying in snow. Others turned away, their spines stiff with guilt, while the rest lingered, not to bid, but to witness the spectacle of a woman's shame. A boy pointed, giggling until his mother yanked him back. Someone lobbed a tarnished nickel at Evelyn's feet, its metallic ping slicing the air like a dare. She didn't flinch, not when Jeb spat her name like a curse, not when the crowd murmured, not even when Roland Tate leaned against a post nearby, his arms crossed but his gaze lowered, as if the law had no teeth here. And then came Lucas, a shadow detaching itself from the blacksmith's awning. He moved like a man accustomed to silence, his boots soundless on the frozen ground, his hat pulled low over eyes the color of storm clouds. The scent of cedar smoke clung to him, mingling with the salt of sweat and solitude. Folks knew his name, but not his story. A rancher who'd buried a wife lost to spring floods, a man who spoke only when the land demanded it. Now he stood, arms folded, watching Evelyn like he was measuring the weight of her worth against the emptiness in his chest. Jeb's calls grew desperate, his grin faltering as bids failed to materialize. A flask arced through the air, a mockery of generosity. A woman whispered, "Lord, forgive us," and vanished into the crowd. Evelyn remained motionless, her lips parted slightly as if tasting the bitterness of the air, her mind adrift in the moment she'd vanished from her own life. Jeb kicked the crate, snarling, "She ain't defective. Carrie's my boy, worth a dozen of your simps." Still no one moved. Then a voice, quiet, steady, final, cut through the dread. "Mine." Lucas stepped forward, his gait slow, deliberate, his gaze locked on Evelyn's. No heat, no theatrics, just a man correcting an error etched into the dirt. Jeb blinked, his bravado cracking. "Say again." Lucas reached into his coat, for silver dollars glinting in his palm, along with a folded slip of paper, a deed, a promise, a reckoning. He laid them on the crate, his hands steady. "I'll take her." Laughter rose, then withered as the crowd realized he wasn't joking. There was no pity in his tone, no shame, only the weight of certainty. Jeb sneered, snatching the coins, his boots scuffing the earth as he turned away without a word. Lucas shrugged off his coat, offering it to Evelyn without touching her, its warmth a stark contrast to the chill in the air. She hesitated, then stepped down, each movement a defiance of the spell that had bound her. Whispers slithered through the crowd. "You'll regret it," someone muttered. "She ain't worth the dirt under your boot," another added. Lucas said nothing. Evelyn didn't flinch. Together, they walked through the square, Roland Tate's mouth twitching in something like approval as the wagon wheels groaned. As the dust settled, the town watched them vanish into the hills, the question lingering like smoke. Why would a man with no words buy a woman with no name? Evelyn's descent from the crate was slow, deliberate, as though each step might crack the fragile spell binding her to the square. The crowd parted like fog retreating from dawn, their faces blurring into shadows, some curious, some contemptuous, most just hollow with the weight of watching. Jeb's sneer lingered in her periphery, but she refused to meet his eyes. Instead, she focused on the coat Lucas offered, its wool heavy with cedar smoke and the lingering heat of his body. She slipped into it without thanks, the fabric swallowing her like a cocoon, its sleeves dragging past her fingertips. It smelled of solitude and pine, a stark contrast to the sour musk of her husband's coat still clinging to her skin. The wagon creaked as Lucas lifted her onto the seat, his hands brushing hers only briefly before he turned to the reins. The mules lurched forward, their hooves crunching over frozen earth, and the square fell away behind them like a fading bruise. Evelyn kept her gaze fixed ahead, though the road blurred into a smear of gray and white. A gust of wind whipped through the open wagon bed, tugging at the hem of the coat, but she didn't shiver. Not anymore. You'll regret it, someone muttered. Marigold, perhaps, or one of the men who tossed coins like alms. The words were meant for Lucas, but Evelyn heard them settle into her ribs like a stone. She didn't answer. Words felt too sharp, too dangerous here. Instead, she watched the town shrink in the distance, its spire, its shuttered windows, its gossip fading into the hills. Only when the last rooftop vanished did she speak, her voice raw and low. Why? Lucas didn't look at her. His hand stayed steady on the reins, knuckles whitening as he guided the mules up a narrow incline. You looked cold, he said, as if that explained everything. The $4 silver, the silence that had swallowed the auction, the way he'd stared at her as though measuring a debt only he could repay. Evelyn's throat tightened. Cold was a flimsy excuse for the weight of what he'd done. She wanted to press him, demand the truth behind his stillness, but the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she folded her hands over her belly, feeling the child stir beneath her palms, a small, defiant flutter against the void. Behind them, Roland Tate's voice cut through the quiet, though his words were lost to the wind. Evelyn caught the tale and never seen a man buy back dignity. She wondered if he meant hers or his own. The mule's hooves kicked up dust, fine as ash, coating the wagon's floor in a haze of gray. Lucas drove on, his jaw clenched, his eyes scanning the horizon, as if hunting for something only he could see. Evelyn's hands trembled, not from fear, not from the cold, but from the question coiling in her mind like a serpent. What kind of man buys a stranger's pain? She studied him sideways, the line of his shoulders, the way his coat hung loose at the waist, the faint scar bisecting his brow. He didn't glance at her, didn't offer comfort or conversation. Yet his presence was a wall between her and the world she'd fled, solid and unyielding. As the road curved into the hills, the silence stretched thick and unbroken. Evelyn let it linger, testing its edges. Was this kindness? Pity? A debt to the ghost in his cabin? She couldn't decide. All she knew was the coat's warmth seeping into her bones, the steady rhythm of hooves, and the growing certainty that Lucas was a man who spoke in acts, not words, and that her life now hung in the space between them. The cabin clung to silence like frost clings to glass, thin, brittle, and suffocating. Its walls, weathered and warped, seemed to lean inward, as if straining to hear the secrets the wind had carried there. The air smelled of ash and lavender, a clash of endings and remnants. With a scent of Lucas's cedar, smoke mingled with something older, softer, almost mournful. He lit the stove without ceremony, the flicker of flame casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the pine beams. The heat came slow, reluctant, as if the cabin itself resisted thawing. Lucas handed Evelyn a tin plate of biscuits and dried apples, his hands rough but deliberate, before retreating to the barn without a word. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving her alone with the weight of the room and the faint crackle of the fire. Night settled into an eerie rhythm. At dawn, Evelyn would find a folded napkin on the table, a biscuit tucked inside, a silent offering, a quiet promise. By evening, she'd return it, smoothed and empty, her hands lingering on the fabric as if tracing the edges of an unspoken conversation. On the third night, while the wind clawed at the shutters and the fire hissed like a restless spirit, Evelyn unfolded the quilt draped over the bed. Its threads were faded, the fabric worn thin by time and use, but her fingers caught on something near the hem, a name. Stitched in uneven, delicate loops, it read Miriam. Her throat tightened, the syllables foreign yet intimate, as though the quilt itself had exhaled a breath it had held for years. She traced the letters, her pulse quickening. Who was she? The woman whose name lingered in the seams of this place, whose quietness Lucas had compared to her own. Was she a shadow, a ghost, a promise he'd never kept? When she finally asked, her voice felt too loud, too sharp for the cabin's hush. Was she kind? The question hung in the air, heavy as the smoke curling from the stove. Lucas paused mid-step, his back to her, as he fed the fire. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he spoke, his voice cracking like dry wood spling under pressure. She was quiet, like you. The words landed like a stone in water, rippling outward. Evelyn's hands clenched the quilt tighter. Quiet was not kindness. Quiet was not forgiveness. It was survival, a language of its own, one she knew too well. Outside, an owl called, its cry sharp and hollow, slicing through the stillness. The fire spat, embers leaping like tiny, defiant stars, as Lucas knelt to stoke the flames. Evelyn watched him, her gaze drifting to the cradle in the corner, the rocker by the hearth, the ink stains on the table, each object a relic of a life she couldn't see but could feel pressing against her skin. Why did he keep her things? Why let the past linger in the corners of a home that now held her breath, her footsteps, her unborn child? She wanted to ask, to pry open the silence and demand answers, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she folded the quilt with care, smoothing the hem where Miriam's name had been stitched, and wondered if this cabin had been waiting for her, or if it was still holding its breath for someone else. By winter, Evelyn's belly had grown taut as the sky before thunder, a living map of the life she carried. Lucas worked in silence, his hands shaping a cradle from rough-hewn pine in the barn, each stroke of his knife deliberate, almost reverent. When he revealed it, nestled beside the hearth, its frame bore stars, small, precise carvings scattered like constellations across the headboard. He said nothing, only ran his thumb over the grooves as if tracing the arc of a promise. But the season's stillness shattered the day Jeb returned. He barged into the cabin without warning, his coat reeking of whiskey and dust, his breath sour as he lunged for Evelyn. "That boy's mine," he snarled, fingers bruising her wrist. The room froze, the fire hissing as if recoiling. Then the door exploded open, a gust of wind, snow, and fury. Lucas stood there, soaked from the storm outside, his silhouette sharp against the gray. "Let go," he said, voice low as a winter creek. Jeb sneered, but didn't release her until Lucas twisted his hand, the snap of bone echoing like a rifle crack. Evelyn's voice cut through the haze, steady and cold. "He was never yours." Roland Tate arrived moments later, drawn by shouts, his rifle slung loose but ready. Jeb spat curses as he stumbled off the porch, vowing vengeance. But Evelyn watched him vanish into the snow with a stillness that unnerved her. When the cabin fell quiet again, Lucas knelt before her, his calloused hands hovering just shy of her trembling knees. "You're safe now," he murmured, but her tears fell anyway. Not from fear, but the weight of a name she couldn't shed. "I still wear his," she whispered, throat tight. Lucas's jaw clenched, the scar on his brow widening. "Not here," he said, finality etching the words into the air between them. That night, as the storm howled, Evelyn called him back to the room. "I'm not afraid of storms anymore," she said, her voice a thread of warmth against the wind's rage. Lucas paused in the doorway, his shadow long in the firelight. "Then neither am I," he replied, though his eyes held the ghosts he'd buried to protect her, the wife lost to floods, the silence he'd worn like armor, the debt he'd paid in solitude. She pressed a folded linen into his hands then, its edges frayed but the stitching within fresh. Sarah, the name she'd written for their daughter, transformed into a blessing. "You don't have to prove anything," he said, but she smiled through exhaustion. "I want to." Outside, the blizzard raged, but inside, the cradle's stars glowed faint in the dim, and the child within her kicked, a rhythm louder than the storm. When Lucas left for the barn, Evelyn lingered by the fire, hand on her belly, and felt the ache of a new kind of strength taking root. Jeb's shadow had passed, but the cradle remained, the stars endured, and the man who spoke in acts, not words, had carved her a home where even storms could not reach. The final wave of pain surged, sharp and unrelenting, as if the storm itself had coiled inside her, its fury churning through her veins. Evelyn's body arched, sweat-soaked hair clinging to her temples, her breath hitching in her throat until it felt like the air itself had turned to glass. Her fingers dug into the bed frame, splinters biting her palms as the world narrowed to the rhythm of her pulse. Thud, thud, thud. A frantic drumbeat against the chaos. The fire in the stove crackled low, its glow flickering like a dying heartbeat, casting shadows that clawed at the corners of the room. Outside, the blizzard roared, its winds tearing at the cabin's shutters until the wood groaned like a creature in pain, its fury mirrored in the tremble of Evelyn's limbs. Then silence, a breathless pause, a suspended moment where time seemed to hold its own breath, before the child arrived with a cry that split the air like dawn-piercing darkness. Lucas's hands trembled for the first time as he cradled the squirming infant, her skin slick and pink, her wail fierce enough to drown out the blizzard. He wrapped her in a warmed cloth, his hands shaking not with fear but awe, as though holding a miracle too bright for mortal grasp. His calloused thumb brushed the child's cheek, a gesture so tender it seemed to erase the years of solitude etched into his bones. The lines around his eyes softened, his weathered face alight with wonder as he traced the delicate curve of her ear, the fine curls clinging to her scalp. A girl. He breathed, the word catching in his throat like a prayer. His voice, rough as gravel yet reverent, carried the weight of a man who had spent years measuring silence only to find himself undone by the sound of a newborn's cry. Evelyn collapsed back, her body spent but her eyes wide with disbelief, pupils dilated like twin moons reflecting the firelight. A laugh escaped her lips, rough, disbelieving, as she reached for the child. "She's strong," she whispered, the words catching in her throat like a sob. Lucas placed Sarah into her arms, his hands lingering for a heartbeat before withdrawing, as if reluctant to let go of the fragile life he'd helped usher into the world. Evelyn pressed her lips to the baby's damp curls, inhaling the scent of milk and warmth, her tears spilling onto the child's brow. Sarah's fists waved like tiny declarations of defiance, her cries softening into contented coos as she nestled against her mother's chest. The scent of cedar smoke and lavender clung to the air, mingling with the primal warmth of new life, a fragile sanctuary against the storm's rage. Outside, the storm began to relent, its fury ebbing into a hush that settled over the land like a held breath. The wind's roar faded to a whimper, the snowfall slowing to a gentle drift that dusted the pines like powdered sugar. Ice-laden branches sagged under their weight, droplets pinging like distant bells as the frost began to loosen its grip. Inside, the past lingered in the ashes of the fire, in the memory of Jeb's threats and the bruises he'd left behind. Would he return? Would the shadows he dragged through their door creep back when the snow melted? Evelyn's throat tightened at the thought, her grip on Sarah instinctively tightening, her knuckles whitening as if to shield the child from ghosts that no longer had a claim. But the child's cry, the fierce, unyielding sound, rang louder than fear. It carried the weight of survival, of a name reclaimed, of a future clawed into existence against impossible odds. Love, she realized, was not a single act, but 1,000 quiet ones. The warmth of Lucas's hand on hers as he guided the kettle to the stove, the cradle carved with stars that waited in the corner, the milk warmed over a fire stoked through the night. It was the way he'd stayed, silent but steadfast, even when the storm threatened to tear the roof from its beams. Could it rewrite a name carved in shame? Evelyn traced her daughter's cheek with a callous thumb, feeling the soft puff of Sarah's breath against her skin. The answer lay in the way the child clung to her, fierce and unafraid, proof that love was not something shouted into the void, but something stitched together, thread by thread, in the spaces between silence. The storm had screamed, but the child's cry had been louder. And in that moment, Evelyn understood. She was no longer the woman sold beneath a gray sky. She was the mother of a girl who would never be bartered, never be silenced. A girl whose first breath had already begun to heal the wounds of a mother's name. Lucas stood, his shadow stretching long in the firelight, and added another log to the stove. The flames leapt higher, casting warmth over the three of them, their breath mingling in the frost-kissed air. Outside, the world lay buried in snow, but inside, the cabin hummed with a new kind of light, a fragile, stubborn glow that neither storms nor shadows could ever truly extinguish. The fire popped, sending embers spiraling upward like tiny constellations, mirroring the stars carved into the cradle's frame. Lucas knelt beside them, his hand hovering near Evelyn's shoulder before settling lightly, a touch that spoke volumes without words. "You did it," he murmured, his voice a low murmur that anchored her to the present. Evelyn met his gaze, her eyes raw but resolute, the shadows of her past receding like tide pulled from shore. "We did," she replied, the syllables trembling yet unbreakable. Sarah stirred, her tiny fist curling around a fold of Evelyn's dress, a grip as tenacious as the roots of the pines outside. The storm had stripped the land bare, but here, in this cabin, life had rooted itself deeper, defiant and unyielding. When Lucas rose to stoke the fire again, Evelyn watched him. The deliberate way he fed the flames, the steadiness of his hands, the quiet reverence with which he moved through their shared space. She thought of Jeb's sneer, the auction square, the way shame had once clung to her like a second skin. Now, it felt as distant as the stars themselves, distant but not forgotten. Yet here was proof that resilience could bloom in the harshest soil. A child's breath against her collarbone. The warmth of the man who had chosen to build instead of break. The fragile, stubborn light of a cabin that refused to be swallowed by the dark. Outside, the world lay still, the storm's remnants dissolving into a hush that felt almost sacred. Inside, the fire burned on, its glow weaving their silhouettes into a tapestry of survival. Its heat a promise that no matter what shadows lingered, they would not return. Not here, not now, not ever. Word spread like fire through dry grass. The woman survived. It began with Marigold, who arrived at dawn one brittle morning, her arms heavy with woolen booties clumsily stitched, the yarn mismatched, but the effort unmistakable. She didn't speak, only placed them on the porch rail beside a jar of preserves and turned away, her shawl pulled tight against the cold, and perhaps against the weight of her own judgment. The pastor's wife followed, leaving a loaf of bread wrapped in linen, its crust still warm when Evelyn found it hours later. No notes accompanied these gifts, no explanations, only the silent acknowledgement that Evelyn Grace was no longer the woman sold beneath a gray sky, but the mother of a child who had survived her first winter. Yet the town's whispers clung like fog. Jeb's ghost lingered in every sidelong glance, every hushed pause when Evelyn's name passed between lips. His absence was a wound that refused to scab, the memory of his threats seeping into the cracks of Grafton's gossip. Then, in March, as the frost began to loosen its grip on the hills, his body was found in a ravine north of town, half buried in mud and pine needles, a whiskey bottle shattered near his boot. Roland Tate declared it a bad horse and worse luck, though his voice wavered like a man testing the truth of his own words. Lucas said nothing. He merely fed the cattle that morning, his hands steady on the reins, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if the land itself had swallowed Jeb whole. Evelyn hung the sign on the porch the day the first daffodils pushed through the thawing earth. Carved from sanded oak, it read, "Evelyn's home." In Lucas's careful script, the letters rough but deliberate, the paint sealed against the rain. She traced the words with her fingertips, half expecting them to vanish like a dream upon waking. That evening, as the sun bled gold across the fields, she turned to Lucas, his hands calloused and raw from splitting logs. Without a word, she lifted one of them, pressing her lips to his knuckles. Not with romance, not yet, but with the quiet reverence of a woman who had been given back her name. Winter's thaw crept forward, the creek unfreezing in hesitant trickles, the pines shedding their ice like armor. Evelyn swept the porch clean each morning, her steps sure as she balanced Sarah on her hip, the child's laughter sharp and bright against the quiet. Yet the question lingered in her chest like a bruise. Had the land forgiven her? The soil still bore the scars of her shame. The trees still stood witness to the auction's cruelty. But the daffodils bloomed anyway, defiant in their yellow clusters. Marigold began nodding when their paths crossed in the mercantile, her fingers lingering on a spool of thread as if weighing the courage to speak. The pastor's wife lingered long enough to ask about the baby's weight, her voice tentative but sincere. Even the boy who once laughed now tipped his hat when he passed the ranch, his cheeks flushed with something like remorse, his eyes avoiding the porch where Evelyn once stood barefoot, sold like grain. Jeb's ghost had not vanished, but it had grown quieter, its voice drowned by the rhythm of daily life. The creak of the cradle, the crackle of the hearth, the sound of child learning to walk. By the time April rains softened the hills, Evelyn no longer flinched at the creak of the front gate or the echo of boots on the porch. The town had not apologized, not truly, but it had stopped expecting her to disappear. And in the stillness of a spring night, as she rocked Sarah to sleep and watched the stars blink above, Evelyn wondered if forgiveness was not a single act, but 1,000 small ones. A booty left on the rail, a loaf of bread shared without words, a sign that declared a home built not from ownership, but from choice. The land, she decided, did not forgive. It endured, and so would she. She thought of Jeb's sneer, the auction square, the way shame had once clung to her like a second skin. Now, it felt as distant as the stars themselves, distant but not forgotten. Lucas stood beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, and she felt the unspoken truth settle between them. Sarah would never know the weight of a name bartered in dirt. She would only know the warmth of a cradle carved with stars, the steadiness of hands that held her world together without ever needing to say why. Outside, the stars burned on, indifferent yet eternal, while the wind hummed a lullaby only the land could hear. And somewhere in the dark, a daffodil bloomed, gold and defiant, proof that even the coldest ground could learn to give life. Evelyn pressed her cheek to Sarah's curls, whispering a vow the night would keep. You are not what they made of me. The daffodils below trembled in the breeze, their roots deep in the same soil that had once held Jeb's body, now softened by spring. Lucas stood, offering his hand without a word, and Evelyn rose, cradling Sarah like a secret too precious to speak aloud. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its embers glowing like hidden truths. They moved as one, their shadows merging on the walls, a family not born of blood but of choice, of quiet acts that spoke louder than vows. Sarah's first step came in spring, a wobbly declaration of life that sent a tremor through the quiet morning. The air hummed with the scent of thawing earth, damp and green, as the breeze tousled her curls into a wild halo. She stood at the edge of the porch, clutching the railing with tiny fists, her wide eyes scanning the yard like a painter assessing a canvas. Lucas, splitting logs nearby, froze mid-swing, the axe suspended in his grip as Evelyn turned from hanging laundry, her breath hitching in her throat. Sunlight filtered through the pine needles overhead, dappling Sarah's face in gold. The child hesitated, her toes curling against the splintered wood, then launched herself forward, a stumble, then a glide, straight into Evelyn's arms. Lucas dropped the axe, the blade thudding in his soft soil as he surged forward, his boots crunching over frost-softened boards. He arrived just as Evelyn knelt, cradling Sarah against her chest, her laughter raw with disbelief. I never thought I'd have a day like this, she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of memories, of chains broken, of nights spent praying for a future she'd scarcely dared imagine. Lucas crouched beside them, his calloused hand brushing a curl from Sarah's forehead, his eyes softening like winter ice yielding to sun. It's not the last, he murmured, the promise settling between them like a seed in fertile soil. The porch creaked beneath their weight, its worn planks still bearing the scars of winters past. Evelyn's fingers lingered on Sarah's back, tracing the faint ridges of her spine, a map of survival etched into tender flesh. Behind them, the wind carried the scent of pine sap and distant rain, weaving through the daffodils below the porch, their golden blooms trembling like tiny flames in defiance of the lingering frost. Lucas's gaze drifted to the horizon, where the hills rolled in gentle waves, their edges softened by mist. He had spent years measuring silence, carving meaning into the spaces between words, but now the quiet felt different, alive, not empty. Evelyn watched him, noting the way his shoulders relaxed, how his thumb absently rubbed the grain of the railing, as though grounding himself in the permanence of this moment. That night, the sky unfurled in a tapestry of stars, their lights spilling over the hills like spilled grain. Evelyn sat on the porch steps, Sarah nestled against her shoulder, the child's fingers curled around a lock of her mother's hair. The air hummed with the first hints of jasmine, the daffodils below the porch pushing through frost-streaked earth in stubborn defiance. Do you think the sky remembers every name? Evelyn asked, her gaze tracing constellations that seemed to pulse with ancient stories. Lucas leaned against the railing, his shadow merging with hers. Only the ones worth keeping, he replied, his voice a low vow that lingered like the scent of cedar after rain. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Miriam's name stitched into a quilt, Jeb's curses dissolving into dust, Sarah's own moniker, a beacon carved into a cradle. Below, the daffodils swayed, their golden heads bobbing as if in silent agreement. Evelyn traced the curve of Sarah's spine, wondering what threads of her own past would weave into the child's bones. Would she inherit the scars, the flinch at loud voices, the ache of a name sold like coin? Or would she carry the strength, the fierce tenderness that had rebuilt a life from splinters? Lucas's hand brushed hers, a fleeting touch that spoke louder than reassurance. Together, they watched the stars blink above, their light filtered through the delicate tracery of pine needles. In that moment, the question of inheritance felt less like a burden and more like a pact, that Sarah would grow up rooted in the soil of resilience, her laughter a hymn to the woman who had refused to be buried, the man who had chosen to build instead of break. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of earth and beginnings, as the child stirred in Evelyn's arms, her tiny fist clutching at the fabric of a world rewritten. Above them, the Milky Way spilled across the heavens, a river of light bridging the vast unknown. Evelyn thought of Jeb's sneer, the auction square, the way shame had once clung to her like a second skin. Now it felt as distant as the stars themselves, distant but not forgotten. Lucas shifted beside her, his shoulder brushing hers, and she felt the unspoken truth settle between them. Sarah would never know the weight of a name bartered in dirt. She would only know the warmth of a cradle carved with stars, the steadiness of hands that held her world together without ever needing to say why. As the child's breath slowed into sleep, Evelyn pressed her lips to Sarah's temple, whispering a vow the night would keep. "You are not what they made of me." The daffodils below trembled in the breeze, their roots deep in the same soil that had once held Jeb's body, now softened by spring. Lucas stood, offering his hand without a word, and Evelyn rose, cradling Sarah like a secret too precious to speak aloud. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled low, its embers glowing like hidden truths. They moved as one, their shadows merging on the walls, a family not born of blood but of choice, of quiet acts that spoke louder than vows. Outside, the stars burned on, indifferent yet eternal, while the wind hummed a lullaby only the land could hear. And somewhere in the dark, a daffodil bloomed, gold and defiant, proof that even the coldest ground could learn to give life. If you're listening now, remember this: Evelyn Grace was never Jeb's shame. She was not the gossip Grafton whispered behind shuttered windows, not the stain of a name sold beneath a gray sky. She was a woman who stood barefoot in the snow, her spine straightened by survival, her breath steady even as the wind clawed at her coat. She had been rebuilt not by words, but by the quiet acts of a man who carved stars into a cradle and carried firewood through blizzards without complaint. Lucas had never promised her love, not in sermons or poetry, but he had given her something sturdier, a porch light that stayed lit for no one else, a fire that never asked questions, and a silence that held more truth than vows shouted into the void. Sarah would grow up knowing none of the names written over her mother's life. She would never hear the clink of coins tossed like curses, never feel the weight of a husband's grip on her wrist. Instead, she would learn the sound of her father's boots on the porch at dawn, the rhythm of his hammer shaping wood into shelter, the warmth of a quilt stitched with two names, hers and her mother's, woven into its hem. Her cradle, carved with constellations, would become a relic of her beginning, proof that her existence had been fought for long before she took her first breath. And when she stumbled across the porch in her first steps, giggling as her mother caught her, she would carry the unshakable certainty that her name had never been bartered, only blessed. The wind still howled through Grafton, its teeth sharp with the memories of judgment and frost. But in the cabin, it hummed lullabies. It whispered through cracks in the shutters, brushing against Sarah's curls as she slept, threading through the dried lavender hanging above the stove, rustling the pages of Lucas's worn Bible as he read aloud without ever raising his voice. The hills around them bore scars of floods, of fires, of winters that had nearly swallowed the land whole. But daffodils pushed through the frost every spring, stubborn and gold, their roots tangled with the ghosts of those who had endured. Evelyn and Lucas never named what bound them. They did not need to. Love in their world was the way he left biscuits wrapped in linen each morning, the way she mended his shirts without asking, The way they stood side by side at the window during storms, watching lightning split the sky without flinching. When Jeb's body was found in the ravine, whiskey and a bad horse, Roland Tate declared, Evelyn planted a row of marigolds by the barn. Not for him, but for the space he had left behind, the weight he had failed to reclaim. Lucas hung the sign on the porch that read Evelyn's home, its paint sealed against rain, its letters a quiet rebellion against every hand that had tried to write her story. Some silences speak louder than vows. Ours were the spaces between their words. The creak of the cradle's wood, the hiss of snow melting on the hearth, the unspoken promise etched into every star carved by a man who had learned to build instead of break. And if you've come this far, if you've walked through the dust of that auction square and the hush of that cabin, remember this. You are not what someone called you in anger. You are not the sum of what was done to you. You're the thing that blooms despite it all. So when the world tries to sell your name, your body, your worth, may you find a porch light waiting, a fire that doesn't ask questions, and a quiet voice that says, you belong here. Just as Evelyn did. Just as Sarah will. Just as you do. Even if no one has said it out loud yet.